The gavel felt heavier than usual in Judge Eleanor Hayes's hand as she surveyed the packed courtroom. Another Monday, another case. The familiar sounds of rustling papers and hushed whispers filled the air as she prepared to begin what she thought would be just another routine hearing. "The state of Louisiana versus James Anderson," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the polished wooden walls. Eleanor glanced down at the case file spread before her. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. The charges painted a picture she'd seen countless times before. Another life tangled in the web of the justice system. She sighed quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of the documents. But when the defendant was brought in, Eleanor's world stopped spinning. The man standing before her bench, hands shackled behind his back, wasn't just another case number. Those eyes, deep, soulful, unmistakably familiar, belonged to someone she'd never forgotten. James Anderson. Her James. The boy who'd been her closest friend, her partner in adventure, her confidant under the old magnolia tree in her childhood backyard. Time seemed to freeze as memories crashed over her like a tidal wave. Summer afternoons racing bicycles down dusty streets, secret meetings by the creek, whispered dreams of changing the world, promises to always have each other's backs no matter what life threw at them. The man before her bore little resemblance to that hopeful boy. His shoulders were hunched with the weight of hardship, his face lined with years of struggle. But his eyes, those eyes held the same gentle spirit she remembered, now clouded with resignation and pain. James looked up, and their gazes met across the courtroom. Recognition flickered in his expression, followed immediately by something that looked like shame. He quickly looked away, his head bowing as if he couldn't bear to face her. Eleanor's throat tightened. Her hands trembled slightly as she fought to maintain her composure. The courtroom waited in silence, sensing something had shifted in the air. "Mr. Anderson?" she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "You stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." His voice was rough, weathered by years of hardship, but unmistakably his. As the prosecutor began his opening statements, Eleanor's mind raced. How had their paths led them here? How had the boy who once shared his lunch with hungry classmates ended up shackled in her courtroom, fighting for his freedom? One thing was certain. This wouldn't be just any case. The courtroom blurred as Eleanor's mind drifted back to a simpler time, before black robes and gavels, before the weight of justice rested on her shoulders. She and James had grown up in Hammond, Louisiana, in a world divided by invisible lines that everyone understood, but no one talked about. Her family's modest white house with its picket fence stood in stark contrast to James's weathered home at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by cotton fields. Their friendship had been an accident of childhood innocence, a chance meeting at a creek where she'd wandered too far from home and found him untangling his fishing line. "Need help?" she'd asked, not knowing that simple question would change both their lives. What followed were years of secret adventures. They'd meet at the edge of town, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues. James had taught her to fish, to climb the tallest trees, to see the world through eyes unclouded by the prejudices their parents carried. "Eleanor," he'd said one evening as they lay on their backs watching stars emerge, "you ever think about leaving this place? Like really getting out, going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" She'd laughed it off then. But James wasn't joking. Even as a child, he understood the weight of the world they lived in, a world that didn't make room for friendships like theirs. The memory of their last day together still haunted her. It was the summer before high school when her father found them on the front porch, sharing stories and dreams like they'd done 100 times before. "Eleanor, get in space. I'd. Now." Her father's voice had been ice cold, filled with an authority she'd never challenged. James had stood frozen, his eyes reflecting hurt and understanding in equal measure. "Go on," he'd said quietly. "I'll see you around." But they never saw each other again. Her father forbade any contact, and soon after, James's family moved away. Eleanor threw herself into her studies, channeling her guilt and longing into academic achievement that eventually carried her to law school and beyond. Now, 25 years later, she sat on the bench that represented everything she'd worked for, staring at the ruins of the boy she'd left behind. The prosecutor, Richard Powell, was painting James as a dangerous criminal, a man who'd walked into a convenience store and attacked an innocent clerk before stealing money from the register. The evidence seemed straightforward. James had been caught blocks from the scene with the stolen cash allegedly still in his possession, but Eleanor knew there had to be more to the story. The James she remembered had once given his lunch to a hungry classmate, going without food himself rather than watching someone else suffer. Could that boy have grown into someone capable of violence? During the lunch break, Eleanor retreated to her chambers, her hands shaking as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Her assistant, Margaret, knocked softly on the door. "Judge Hayes? Are you feeling all right? You seemed distracted out there." Eleanor forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be when the ghost of her past sat just feet away, waiting for her to decide his fate? The weight of her position had never felt heavier. When court resumed, the prosecution's case continued to unfold. A store clerk testified about seeing a man matching James's description attack the cashier and grab money from the register, but under cross-examination by James's defense attorney, Lisa Porter, cracks began to appear. "Mr. Chambers," Lisa pressed, "you said the attacker was wearing a red hoodie. Did you see his face clearly?" "Not really," the witness admitted. "It was dark, and he had the hood up." "So you couldn't definitively identify the person who committed this crime?" The witness squirmed. "Well, no, but—" Eleanor watched James throughout the testimony. He sat perfectly still, his hands clasped in front of him, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when the prosecutor spoke. This wasn't the demeanor of a hardened criminal. This was a man fighting for his life against a system that had already made up its mind about him. The surveillance video from the store was grainy and poorly lit, showing only a shadowy figure in a hoodie. The prosecution insisted it was James, but the image quality made definitive identification impossible. Eleanor studied the footage intently, searching for any detail that might reveal the truth. James's defense was simple but problematic. He claimed he'd been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. The friend, however, was too afraid to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community. Without corroborating witnesses, James's alibi seemed hollow. As the day wore on, Eleanor felt the familiar ache of injustice settling in her chest. She'd seen this pattern before, poor defendants with inadequate resources facing a system stacked against them. But this time, it was personal. This time, it was James. When court adjourned, she watched him being escorted out in shackles, his back straight despite everything. The boy who'd once dreamed of changing the world was now fighting just to survive it. That night, Eleanor sat in her study, staring at old photographs from her childhood. In one, she and James were grinning at the camera, their arms around each other's shoulders, innocent of the world that would eventually tear them apart. She thought about the choices that had led them here. Her choice to walk through that door when her father commanded it, leaving James alone on the porch. His family's choice to move away rather than fight the system. Her choice to pursue success in a world that rewarded conformity over courage. Now she had one more choice to make. The most important one of her career. The courtroom hummed with tension as the defense began presenting their case. Lisa Porter approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone who'd found a crack in what seemed like an airtight prosecution. "Officer Daniel Harris," she began, addressing the arresting officer. "You stated that you apprehended Mr. Anderson 2 blocks from the scene of the alleged robbery. What led you to believe he was the suspect?" Officer Harris, a burly man with tired eyes, shifted uncomfortably. He matched the description: black male, mid-40s, dark clothing. Lisa's eyebrows rose slightly. Dark clothing? But the suspect in the surveillance video was described as wearing a red hoodie. "Did you find a red hoodie when you searched Mr. Anderson?" "No," Harris admitted reluctantly. "Did you conduct a search of the surrounding area for this missing hoodie?" "We didn't have time for that." Eleanor leaned forward, sensing something significant unfolding. Lisa pressed on with surgical precision. "So you arrested my client based solely on a vague description, without any physical evidence, linking him to the scene?" Harris's silence spoke volumes. Several jury members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Officer Harris," Lisa continued, "what did Mr. Anderson say when you arrested him?" "He protested, said he was innocent." "And did you investigate his claim, or did you assume guilt based on his appearance?" The officer's face reddened. "I followed protocol." Eleanor's heart raced as she watched the prosecution's case crumble. This wasn't just about insufficient evidence anymore. It was about a system that saw guilt in the color of a man's skin rather than the content of his character. The defense's next witness stunned the courtroom. Lisa called Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic video analyst who'd examined the surveillance footage. "Dr. Williams," Lisa began, "what did your analysis reveal about the video evidence?" "Several concerning irregularities," the expert testified. "First, based on the height and build measurements I was able to extract from the footage, the perpetrator appears to be at least 3 inches taller than Mr. Anderson. Second, and more troubling, the timestamp on the video has been altered." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Objection! This is speculation!" "Overruled," Eleanor said firmly. "Please continue, Dr. Williams." "The metadata shows clear signs of manipulation. Someone wanted to make this footage appear more incriminating than it actually is." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Evidence tampering. Someone had deliberately tried to frame James. But who? And why? The revelation changed everything. What had seemed like a straightforward case of robbery was becoming something much darker. A conspiracy designed to destroy an innocent man. During the recess, Eleanor noticed Officer Harris in heated conversation with the prosecutor near the courthouse steps. Through her chamber's window, she watched Powell make an urgent phone call, his face flushed with anger. When James took the stand in his own defense, his voice carried a quiet dignity that reminded Eleanor of the boy she'd once known. "I've made mistakes in my life," he told the jury. "I've trusted the wrong people, made bad choices when I was desperate, but I didn't do this. That night I was walking home from my friend Marcus's house, minding my own business, when the police stopped me." His voice cracked slightly. "They didn't ask questions. They just decided I fit the description. I've been fighting my whole life to be seen as more than what people assume about me. I'm tired of fighting, but I won't stop fighting for the truth." Eleanor's throat tightened as she watched several jury members wipe their eyes. James wasn't just testifying about a crime. He was testifying about a lifetime of injustice, of being judged by his appearance rather than his actions. But the biggest shock came when Lisa called her final witness. "Your Honor, the defense calls Marcus Thompson." A thin man in his 40s walked nervously to the stand. Eleanor recognized the fear in his eyes, the same fear that had silenced him earlier. "Mr. Thompson," Lisa said gently, "you were reluctant to testify earlier. What changed your mind?" Marcus glanced at James, then squared his shoulders. I saw the news about that video being tampered with. I realized keeping quiet wasn't protecting anybody. It was just letting the real criminals win. Can you tell us about the night in question? James was at my house until almost midnight. We were working on my car. The transmission was acting up, and James knows engines better than anybody. He didn't leave until 11:45 p.m. The robbery happened at 11:30. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Eleanor banged her gavel, but she felt her own shock rippling through her chest. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Lisa asked. Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "Because I was scared. I got arrested 3 years ago on trumped-up charges, and Officer Harris was the one who arrested me. He made it clear what would happen if I ever crossed the department again." Eleanor's gaze snapped to Harris, who had gone pale. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. "Mr. Thompson," Lisa continued, "do you have any proof that James was with you that night?" Marcus pulled out his phone. "I took a picture of the engine after we fixed it. James is in the background. The timestamp shows 11:52 p.m. He handed the phone to the bailiff, and the image appeared on the courtroom's display screen. There was James, smiling slightly, grease on his hands, standing next to a car engine. The timestamp clearly showed he was miles from the crime scene when the robbery occurred. The prosecutor's objections were desperate and futile. The evidence was overwhelming. James Anderson was innocent, and someone had gone to great lengths to frame him. As the implications sank in, Eleanor realized this case had become about much more than one man's innocence. It was about exposing a system of corruption that targeted vulnerable members of the community, manufacturing evidence, and intimidating witnesses to secure convictions. The boy she'd abandoned on her front porch had become a man fighting not just for his freedom, but for justice itself. The courtroom felt electric as the prosecution made their closing argument. But Richard Powell's words rang hollow now. His confident demeanor had crumbled in the face of overwhelming evidence of police misconduct and evidence tampering. "Ladies and gentlemen," Powell said, his voice lacking its earlier conviction, "despite what the defense would have you believe, we still have a defendant who was found with stolen money." Lisa Porter rose for her closing argument, her voice strong and clear. "What we have is a man who was walking home from helping a friend fix a car. What we have is manipulated evidence, intimidated witnesses, and a police officer who decided my client was guilty before any investigation took place." She gestured toward James, who sat with quiet dignity despite everything he'd endured. James Anderson's only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time while being the wrong color in the eyes of those sworn to protect and serve. The real criminals aren't sitting at the defendant's table. They're hiding behind badges and prosecutorial immunity. Eleanor watched the jury's faces as Lisa spoke. She could see the shift in their expressions, from uncertainty to understanding to anger at the injustice they'd witnessed. "This case isn't just about James Anderson," Lisa continued. "It's about whether we're willing to accept a system that manufactures guilt to satisfy our prejudices, or whether we'll demand real justice based on real evidence and real truth." When the jury retired to deliberate, the courthouse buzzed with speculation. Eleanor retreated to her chambers, her mind reeling from everything that had been revealed. The corruption, the evidence tampering, the systematic targeting of innocent people. It was worse than she'd ever imagined. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Her bailiff entered with a concerned expression. "Judge Hayes, there's something you should know. Officer Harris was just arrested by Internal Affairs. Turns out Dr. Williams wasn't the only one who found problems with that video. The FBI has been investigating police corruption in this district for months." Eleanor's hands trembled as she absorbed the news. "What about the real robber? They caught him 2 hours ago trying to pawn the jewelry that was also stolen from the store. Turns out he's been working with a dirty cop to frame innocent people and split the proceeds. Harris was feeding him information about who to target, people without resources to fight back." The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. James hadn't been randomly selected as a suspect. He'd been deliberately chosen because someone thought he'd be easy to convict and impossible to defend. When the jury returned after 3 hours of deliberation, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. News of the corruption scandal had spread, and reporters filled every available seat. The foreman, an elderly woman with steel in her eyes, stood with the verdict in her trembling hands. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, on the charge of armed robbery, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted in applause and tears. Eleanor banged her gavel, but she made no real effort to restore order. James sat perfectly still for a moment, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. Then his shoulders began to shake as 25 years of pain and injustice finally found release. Eleanor's voice was thick with emotion as she addressed the court. "Mr. Anderson, you are free to go. Court is dismissed." But she wasn't finished. As the crowd began to file out, Eleanor stood. "Before this court is officially closed, I want to say something." Her voice carried across the room, stopping people in their tracks. "What happened here today represents both the worst and the best of our justice system. We've seen how corruption can poison the pursuit of truth, how prejudice can masquerade as law enforcement, and how the innocent can be sacrificed to satisfy our biases." She looked directly at James, who had turned to face her. "But we've also seen the power of courage. The courage of witnesses who chose truth over fear. The courage of attorneys who refused to accept injustice. And the courage of a man who never stopped fighting for his dignity, even when the whole system seemed arrayed against him." Eleanor's voice grew stronger. "This court has failed Mr. Anderson once by allowing him to be prosecuted on manufactured evidence. We will not fail him again. I am ordering a full review of every case involving the officers and prosecutors involved in this misconduct. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice perverted is worse than both." The applause was thunderous now. James wiped tears from his eyes as the shackles were removed from his wrists for the final time. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Eleanor remained at the bench, watching James sign his release paperwork. When he finished, he walked slowly toward her, stopping a few feet from the bench. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two children who'd grown up to become symbols of different sides of the same broken system. "Thank you," James said quietly. Eleanor shook her head. "Don't thank me. Thank the people who had the courage to speak up when it mattered. Thank yourself for never giving up." James studied her face, and for a moment she saw the boy she'd once known looking back at her. "Eleanor," he said, using her first name for the first time since the trial began. "I forgive you." The words hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed to hear them until they were spoken. "I don't deserve that," she whispered. "Maybe not," James replied with a sad smile. "But I'm giving it to you anyway. Because holding on to that anger would make me just as poisoned as the system that put me here." 3 months later, Eleanor stood in the same courtroom, but everything had changed. The walls had been freshly painted, and sunlight streamed through windows that had been cleaned for the first time in years. The room felt different, lighter somehow, as if the truth that had been spoken there had purified the very air. She was presiding over a hearing for the Police Reform Commission that had been established in the wake of James's case. The FBI investigation had uncovered a network of corruption involving dozens of officers and prosecutors across 3 parishes. Evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and systematic targeting of minority defendants had been exposed and was being systematically addressed. Officer Harris sat in the defendant's chair now, along with 2 other corrupt officers and the prosecutor who had tried to convict James. They were facing charges that would likely send them to prison for decades. Eleanor felt a different kind of satisfaction in presiding over these proceedings. This was justice in its truest fee. Not the mechanical application of laws, but the active pursuit of truth and fairness. After the hearing, Eleanor walked through the courthouse halls that had become a symbol of reform rather than institutional racism. Photos lined the walls now. Pictures of exonerated defendants, reformed officers, and community leaders who had emerged from the scandal determined to build something better. In the center of the display was a photo that meant more to Eleanor than all the others combined. It showed James Anderson at a community center he'd opened in Hammond, teaching automotive repair to young people who needed job skills and hope in equal measure. Eleanor had driven to the center the previous weekend, finally working up the courage to visit the man she'd rediscovered in her courtroom. She'd found James under the hood of an old Chevrolet, patiently explaining carburetor mechanics to a teenager who reminded her of James at that age. "You know," James had said when he saw her, wiping his hands on a shop rag, "I used to think the system was broken. Now I realize it was working exactly as designed. It just wasn't designed for people like me." They'd walked through the center together, past classrooms where former gang members learned computer programming, past workshops where single mothers earned welding certifications, past offices where volunteer lawyers provided free legal aid to people who couldn't afford representation. "This is what you dreamed about," Eleanor had said, remembering their childhood conversations about changing the world. "Part of it," James had replied. "But it took almost losing everything to figure out how to make it real." Now, standing in her courtroom at the end of another day, devoted to justice rather than mere law enforcement, Eleanor reflected on how much had changed since that shocking morning when she'd recognized her childhood friend in shackles. The case had ended James's nightmare, but it had begun her awakening. She'd realized that her position on the bench wasn't just about interpreting laws. It was about ensuring those laws served justice rather than perpetuating injustice. Eleanor had started a judicial reform initiative, working with other judges to identify patterns of discrimination in sentencing and prosecution. She'd established a fund to provide better legal representation for indigent defendants. Most importantly, she'd learned to see beyond the surface of every case that came before her bench. As she prepared to leave the courthouse, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from James. "Saw the news about the Reform Commission. Proud of you. Jay." She smiled, typing back, "Proud of you too. Always have been." That evening, Eleanor drove through Hammond, past the old neighborhoods where she and James had grown up. The town looked different now. Not because the buildings had changed, but because she saw it through different eyes. She stopped at the old magnolia tree where she and James used to meet, now part of a small park that the city had created. A plaque near the tree read, "Dedicated to the power of friendship, to overcome the divisions that separate us." As she stood beneath the tree's spreading branches, Eleanor thought about the paths that had led her and James through decades of separation to that moment of recognition in her courtroom. The boy who'd been forced to leave her front porch had become a man who'd taught her the true meaning of justice. The girl who'd walked through her father's door had become a woman who'd learned that real courage meant opening doors for others. A group of children ran past, laughing and playing together without regard for the color of their skin or the differences in their backgrounds. Eleanor watched them with hope, knowing that James's community center and her judicial reforms were part of building a world where those children would grow up with opportunities that had been denied to previous generations. The sun was setting over Hammond, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor pulled out her phone and took a picture of the magnolia tree, then sent it to James with a simple message. "Thank you for teaching me what justice really looks like." His response came quickly. "Thank you for learning." As Eleanor drove home, she carried with her the knowledge that some friendships are strong enough to survive decades of separation, Some mistakes can be forgiven and redeemed, and some systems can be changed by people brave enough to demand better. The boy and girl who'd once dreamed of changing the world under a magnolia tree had finally found their way back to each other. Not as the children they'd been, but as the adults they'd become through struggle, separation, and ultimately, the courage to choose justice over comfort. In the end, that was enough to change everything.